Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Madokoro. I am an associate professor here in the Department of History at Carleton, and it is my tremendous pleasure to chair this panel to kick off day 3 of the conference, Beyond Resettlement. This panel is called Investigating the Legacy, Understanding the Ugandan Asian Refugee Resettlement Initiatives, Impacts, and Conceptions of Identity. And like much of the rest of the conference, it's going to be very rich, I think, in dialogue and ideas. Our first panelist, so one of our panelists, Dr. Sara Cosemans, is going to be presenting online. So we're actually going to start with somebody who needs no introduction, in fact, forgot to put his bio in the program, but Dr. Shazan Mohammedi, who will speak to the question of 100% Canadian, exploring the personal reflections on identity and belonging amongst Ugandan Asian refugees in Canada. And because you didn't put a bio in the program, I'm going to indulge and say that, as many of you know, Shazan has put together just an extraordinary conference with Heather, and we've had the pleasure, many of us, of supporting their work, but really it's been Shazan and Heather who brought us all together. And Shazan is also the author of the wonderful work, Gifts from Amin, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your presentation this morning, given the great work that you've been doing in this area. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think the slides will come up over time, but as that's getting done, yeah, thank you all for making it this morning. I know the weather made things quite challenging. I know I was waiting for the bus for 45 minutes, and so glad to be here. I think for the most part, I'm going to do something a little bit different with my presentation today, and really just focus on the sort of key themes that came out in the interviews. So there were 4 things that really, really stood out as I was doing these interviews with Ugandan Asian refugees. So these are folks that probably came when they were around, their late teens, maybe mid-20s. I only interviewed about 2 or 3 folks that were in their, I guess, early 30s, just with the timing, of course. And so the first thing that really came out was this idea of Canadian identity. So I'll speak a lot more to that a little bit later, but this concept of what it means to be Canadian really kind of came out to the fore. The second was a lot of folks talked about having multiple identities, so affiliations to, their ethnic backgrounds, their religious backgrounds, their national background. Others talk about having like a mélange, a mixture of how these things fuse together. And then the last 2 parts that we'll talk about, the first is going to be this concept of contested identities. And so what ends up happening is because of what you look like, the politics of identity matter. And so that's something that really came to the fore as well. And the last thing is this really interesting theme that came out about volunteerism and how a lot of folks talked about part of being a Canadian is being a volunteer. So I'll talk about those 4 things. And the interviews themselves, they were really unstructured. And so I was really happy to do something like that, where I kind of asked folks, how do you identify yourself? No wrong answers. Go in any direction you want, define it how you want, and even question the question. And I'm delighted that Jalal is actually here because he was one of the only interviewees that pushed back against the question to say, are we trying to narrowly define me? And I'll dive into that a little bit later, but I think that's a really interesting thing. And when it comes to identity studies, one of the things that's really fascinating is on the surface, a lot of the times they focus on this concept of national identities. Are you quote unquote Canadian or Ugandan or Goan or, really these national affiliations? And the reality is we're complex human beings. We've got all kinds of identities and they interchange with each other. They're multifaceted. They end up evolving over time. And the other thing that's really interesting is scholars have started to point out things like situational identities. So depending on what context you're in, who you're with, different identities come to the fore and others move to the background. So we'll use myself as a fun example on this one. So right now I'm presenting as an academic. So I have my academic hat on as part of, as part of the Uganda collection, as the son of a Ugandan Asian refugee family, presenting, this type of research. When I'm at work, I'm a public servant thinking about refugee policy and things like that. And of course, when I'm at home, my number one status is, as the youngest of 3 boys, being the most spoiled with my parents, like that's the only thing that matters. And so, that's one of the things. So Eric Hobsbawm really talks about this concept of identity, and we can't really make that assumption that national identification is the number one thing for folks. And so, yeah, let's dive in. Let's hear from how people describe themselves. And so I always like really starting, and it's the title of the talk with Amin Mohammed, and he kind of says, I'm Canadian, 100%. I believe in the values of Canada. And this really gets built upon by others like John Alani, who sadly passed away quite recently in the earlier this year. And his quote really speaks to this. He says, his identity is, quote, simple. We are citizens of this country. So our loyalty is to Canada, and we play our role in the day-to-day affairs of this country, and we see where our input is required. And so for both Mohammed and John, their identities as Canadians were really clear and uncontested. When I approached them about this question, they really seemed to have the answer prepared. One of the things that I wanted to ask was, when we talk about Canadian values, what do you mean? And so Amin Mohammed offered an answer where he says, for me, the freedom to express yourself, freedom of religion, respecting others' religions, tolerating other people's views. And so that's what he kind of reveals as this concept of what it means to be Canadian. And so Zulfikar, another person that I interviewed, also really echoes these same sentiments. And so his quote says, I appreciate the values of Canada from day one. They let me practice my religion. I can speak out. And this kind of comes out in different mediums and different forms. The Ismaili Canada magazine has an article that was published in 1987 that talks about some of these values, but then other Ugandan Asian refugees also talk about this as well from, different religious backgrounds as well. So while Senator Mombina Jaffer is part of the Ismaili community, she also talks about this, and she says, Canada has really, quote, made a space is sharing and making spaces for all of us, which is really, really interesting. And so I think a lot of folks have kind of leaned on this concept of the inclusivity of holding multiple identities, of being part of Canada. And so it gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about these multiple identities. And so I'll dive right into how John Nazareth articulates this. And he does a really beautiful job of it, in my opinion. He says, I am a Canadian, a Ugandan, an African, an Indian, and a Goan. You don't have to choose except if one goes to war with another. But in this case, I don't have to choose. And I embrace all of them. They're all part of my psyche. And when I'm with Ugandan Africans, something almost goes click in my brain, and I joke like a Ugandan. And so this is a really, really fascinating concept, and I think we've all kind of observed it in our own daily lives. You'll hear your partners or your siblings or others, especially with the work from home during the pandemic, you'll hear their work tone, and you're like, whoa, I've never heard you speak to someone like that. Or, their expertise, right, in their subject matter and things like that. And so this is something that really resonated with me, throughout the pandemic, but is also something really true of folks in their daily lives. And so I do want to put a bit of a spotlight on this like multiple identity concept, because it is something that is quite interesting. And so Jalal offers a really interesting unique. So when I asked him about, how do you identify himself, his answer is certainly very Canadian. I've got a cultural heritage, which is Indian, which I'm not at all defensive about. So I am a combination of all of that, and proudly so. But if you say, does my absolute loyalty go to Canada as a country? Of course it does. Vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis Africa, of course it's Canada, right? But to identify me or put me in a narrow hole, are you a Smiley? Are you Canadian? What does Canadian mean? Canadian to me incorporates all of these, the value system, the cultural background, the attitudes, whatever. So that's a long-winded answer to a simple question, but I'm questioning the question. And I think this was a brilliant articulation of this really difficult concept where when we talk about identities and identity politics, sometimes it can get really, really wrapped up in this simple notion that we're just one thing, or maybe you're two things, but you can't be 10, 15 and have those change over time, and also just change based on which room you're in. And so I think that's a really, really interesting concept. And Zaina kind of builds on this in hers. She says, if I look back from an identity perspective, it's a mixture of it all. It's a mélange of the two. And so she really talks about having both a Ugandan and Canadian identity. And for her, she was quite interesting because she spoke about how her conception of home was wherever her family was. So she's like, it doesn't matter where the physical, table we're sitting around for dinner is, so long as the same folks are there, that does feel like home. So really, really fascinating. I think one of the challenging parts, and this kind of leads into this idea of contested identities, is John Nazareth when he looks back at his conception of being a Goan, a Ugandan African, a Ugandan Asian, he kind of writes this quote when he's leaving. When he's leaving the country, he writes a letter to the public service. So he was a public servant in Uganda for a long time. He actually left after the expulsion decree. And so he writes, quote, after submitting his official resignation letter to the Ugandan government, he explained that, quote, actually, I sort of remember telling them that I'm so thankful that you gave me a chance to really contribute to my country. And when I wrote that and I signed it, I really shed a few tears because that was a break. I can never think about that without breaking. I can't. And so his personal history revealed that direct impact of his historical background, but also that this was a physical and psychological break from that attachment to Uganda that he felt genuinely. Thankfully, John was later able to reclaim this identity when he founded the Goan Ugandan Association in Toronto. That's been doing quite well, actually, for quite a few years now. And so the other thing that comes to the fore is this concept of contested grounds of asserting your identity. And so there we go. A lot of folks kind of talked about how you're always asked these questions. And so Errol's also in the room, so I'll quote from him as well. And he talks about this, that he says, you know, if you answer the question, when people ask, where are you from? Errol says, if you answer the question with, I'm Canadian, people don't accept that as an answer, right? That unfortunately will last for the next up-teen generations because people associate if you are Canadian, you have to be Caucasian, right? I mean, that's how it will always be because they want to know your ancestry and they want to know where you actually come from. And so this is sort of that infamous question that everyone gets is, where are you really from? And so it's something that's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to many other folks in this room when they're asked these questions of where are you from? And so Altaf also answers and provides another perspective, and he's a college professor at Algonquin, and so he talks about how every year when he starts the school year, he walks into the classroom and he gets these very similar questions. And so he says, you know, they always think you're from India, and they say, where are you from? And I say, where do you think I'm from? And they never think of me as from Africa. But for us, you know, you have to go back and you have to say, well, I'm from Uganda. Then I start explaining it to them. My thing was different. My dad was not born in India. He was born in Uganda. My grandfather came from India, so my dad was born in Uganda too, right? So it's a whole different thing. We're Ugandans. My mom was only 8 months when she came to Uganda, so she wasn't anything else except Ugandan. So it's hard to explain, right? First and foremost, we are from Uganda, and you have to start telling that story. And so others offer these really interesting insights. I think I'm a little bit pressed for time, so I'll move through. Okay, perfect. That's good. So the other things that really came forward is, you know, this concept of Canada's roots in Canada. Yeah, and so I'll talk about another example. So Carm kind of talks about this as well, and he says, and so he's a dentist, and so he often has like new patients, and so has that chit chat when you start. And so he talks about it, and he says, people look at me and they say, you're from, and I'll say, I'm Canadian. No. But where are you really from? I say Uganda. Oh, not India? No, I've never stepped foot in India. I think what you want to hear is that my blood is East Indian. My grandfather was from India, but he moved to Uganda where my dad was born, and I was born, so theoretically, I'm African. And then I am now in Canada, and I was a refugee when I came here. So now, by citizenship, I'm Canadian. And so I think these historical roots really inform these conceptions of self. And it is really a unique way of defining yourself because it is all individual. There's no sort of right answer to the question. And I think that's what we're seeing in these myriad of responses. I think, you know, these things are blurred across both space and time. And one of the things that was really interesting is that some folks, when they talked about their identity, they chose not to talk about certain folks. So Terry in his interview didn't identify with being a Ugandan no longer. So he kind of said, you know, in his quote, he says, I've closed that door. And he felt that was something, I'll use the actual quote. So we usually say we're Goan ancestry, Goan and brought up in Africa, and we live most of our life in Canada. So I always say that. And so Terry, for him, he says, you know, I really had a great life in Uganda. I enjoyed it. We had just a fairy tale life in Uganda. But that door is shut. and I have no interest. And so in our interview, you kind of elaborated on this to say, I think that's what actually helped some of us with the integration process here in Canada, was by being able to shut that door, quote unquote, we were able to move forward. And I think this is something that's really interesting, especially as being part of that second generation, trying to learn more about our family's history, because he was explaining to him why that door was shut. And so why this was something that, even my own mom did not talk to me about growing up until much, much later. I had to do a PhD to get her to open up, so, but that's how it was. And so I think that's one of the really interesting things and one of the challenges. But I do want to kind of close about this concept of volunteerism, which came out, which was really, really interesting. So a lot of folks have been engaged locally, globally. They've started foundations in India for rural, for girls to access education. They've started mobile clinics in Uganda and the Kiboga district, and there's numerous examples of this philanthropy and this concept. And what was really, really interesting is it's something that other scholars have found is that, part of being a Canadian is volunteerism, and it's something that they were finding amongst migrant communities in particular. And so I'll quote from Zulfikar. He talks about how he's been a member of the Rotary Club since 1977, and he says, quote, "It's what makes you Canadian. It's just all the values, and you participate in Easter Seal campaigns. Yeah, you become a part of all of this, and you feel Canadian." And I also really want to borrow from a study by Miedma and Tesla Sogu's article, where they interview a newcomer as well, and they say, quote, "She became a Canadian citizen by doing community work, a real Canadian citizen by doing Canadian work." And I think this is a really, really interesting space, and they build on this, and they say, volunteering offers, quote, "a safe place to explore, make friends, build networks, become politically active, and learn how to navigate Canadian society." And so I think that's unbelievably fascinating to see these kinds of themes. And, of course, I invite questions later on, and I'm here all day as well. But I think in conclusion, I think this is one of the things that we have to really start to unravel, is that identity is, of course, incredibly complex, and it has a great sense of meaning for folks. It can have significant levels of impact, but it is something that requires efforts from both newcomers and the host community. And so I think the more opportunities that we can create and facilitate for these types of cultural exchanges, for these things like volunteer opportunities, we can really start to see and replicate some of the success that happened in this community to others. And we are seeing it. We are seeing, we hear the stories of, the Fort McMurray fires, and some of the first folks to volunteer were Syrian refugees that had come only a few months earlier. And these are these really fascinating and, of course, like, beautiful and heartwarming stories, but they're real. They're real, and they're powerful. And I think that's something that, as the Canadian public, we really want to look forward to, and something we should also, put pressure on in the public service and in other avenues as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was a really wonderful way to get us started. And when you talked about identities changing over time, I thought, well, maybe you might write a second book. So just planting that seed. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sara Cosemans, who's going to present online. And I have an oversight in that I didn't welcome our online attendees this morning, so it's great to have people joining virtually as well. Sara is going to present a paper titled Globalizing Resettlement, the Role of the Ugandan Asian Expulsion in the Emergence of a Neoliberal Refugee Regime. Sara is joining us, I believe, from Belgium. She can confirm, where she's working as a doctor assistant in cultural history at KU Leuven, and she has also joined the School of Social Sciences at UHasselt, where she teaches one course as an assistant professor. And I'll just say that I'm especially looking forward to Sara's presentation because her PhD work was incredible. It was funded by the Research Foundation Flanders. It was conducted at KU Leuven, and it concentrated on the impact of the resettlement of refugees from the Global South. So it included not only Ugandan Asians, but also refugees from Chile and Vietnam. And it's really a path-breaking piece of work. So it's amazing for us to have Sara here this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction. You can hear my voice, it's a little bit hoarse. I'm having a November cold, but I'm gonna get through it. I cannot see you, but I hope that you can hear me well. And first, I want to acknowledge that Ugandan Asians tremendously benefited from resettlement and did exceptionally well. And I think Shazan's paper was a testimony to that. So many things we have heard at the conference already were. And this cannot be stressed enough. Also, because when we're looking at the future, like the UNHCR representative did yesterday, resettlement remains one of these amazing features of the refugee regime that could lead to new lives for people. Yet, this paper has a different focus on Ugandan Asians' undesirability and the effect that the resettlement caused on the refugee regime. Repercussions, I believe, have an effect until today. I want to really guide you through this undesirability issue in 5 major steps. First, I want to look a little bit at the premises on which the resettlement was based. Then I'll take you through the legal identities of Ugandan Asians that caused their undesirability in a way, which was done before me by Professor Mamdani, so I can be brief about that. And then I'll go into the issue of a crisis long foreshadowed as an expulsion that didn't come so surprisingly as is often expected. Then I'll go through the British attempts to deny the responsibility. And at the end, I will reflect on the neoliberal aspect as I identify it. Because in this talk, I shall argue that resettlement was an early manifestation of a liberal refugee regime. And by liberal, I understand it in a sense that has been recently worked out by Quinn Slobodian of restoring colonial or imperial power hierarchies without the settler colonialism. Thus, neoliberalism in my paper is not just an economic system, it's a political system of a time of intense power reconfiguration. And Amin, as we have heard yesterday during the keynote, was a clever and strong opponent to the status quo. But as I will show, through resettlement, the British eventually did gain the upper hand and they could restore a power balance in their favor. Moreover, their strategy was so successful that it inspired imitation. In 1975, the Americans attempted something similar with their refugees coming from Vietnam, directly quoting the Ugandan Asians as an example. So the Ugandan Asians had quite a legacy here. But before we get to that legacy, I invite you to consider the Ugandan Asian resettlement initiative through a new lens, and that is the lens of undesirability. So let's get started with the premises, and I have 3 of them. For the British, the expulsion of the Ugandan Asians was part of a burden of winding up empire. It came out of a long struggle of decolonization. And as such, this was a very unwelcome move. They did not want to receive Ugandan Asians at all. These migrants were undesirable also in the light of what had happened before to other immigrants and immigrant groups in Britain. And yet they are very capable of reframing the issue in terms of humanitarian and moral obligations, as we have heard yesterday. What is also important to remember, and I know this is a specialist audience, so you all know, is that almost no refugees entered the UK. This is to say, the UK only admitted people who had British citizenship. Everyone who did not end up in the UK. It took years before Britain allowed any refugees in. I think it was 1976 before legally recognized refugees under the international system had some more leeway into entering into the UK. I'll come back to that in a moment, why that was. And third, we cannot understand the resettlement effort by myopically focusing on Britain. And I know in this conference we are not doing that, but you know, as long as we perpetuate the message that Britain took the largest share, and then India and Canada, and also some other parts in the world, we are in fact perpetuating a narrative that does center on the British effort. So we have to understand, and this is my, my plea, what Britain did to globalize this effort and why this was so important on the long term for the refugee regime as a whole. The globalization in the first place took place in relationship to India, then to the Commonwealth, and also crucially later beyond that. So to start with a brief note on Ugandan Asians' legal identity. And since Professor Mamdani explained this yesterday, I won't go into too much detail, but I want you to understand one thing. One of the reasons why Ugandan Asians were different from, for instance, their Kenyan counterparts was because Uganda was a protectorate in the British Empire and not a colony. And this had profound impact on Ugandan Asians' legal identity. While in colonies, British subjects gained the right to citizenship, in protectorates, they often did not, and they would become British protected persons, which after 1948 was a status that entailed no citizenship whatsoever. It was only consular protection, and it was only passports and the right to travel to Britain. So while Asians in Canada were mostly citizens at the time of independence, most of them chose to retain their British nationality, their citizenship. There was very little incentive to change their nationality. But Ugandan Asians were different, and they were actively encouraged, at least 10,000 of them, if we can believe the records, were actively encouraged to change their BPP status, so British Protected Person status, to Ugandan citizenship. But then the British government, thinking it was acting on a gentleman's agreement with the Ugandans, did not comply to Ugandan constitutional provisions for renunciation of citizenship. And so many of these BPPs were in the understanding that they had Ugandan citizenship, but this was never the case. And so they become de facto stateless. And in the beginning, this doesn't matter very much because they still have the right to travel to Britain, but this is to change very quickly as well. In 1962 and then in 1968, when British immigration law changes, they lose the right to travel freely to the UK. And so they effectively get trapped. They are not able to leave Uganda or to travel to Britain anymore on their British passports, but they also don't have other passports or other citizenship claims. They are effectively stateless. And the British knew this. There are several instances of officials being very acutely aware of the fact that this group was there. And I quote just one from 1969 from David Scott, the UK's High Commissioner in Kampala, to Fitzgerald, one of the higher up officials at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Scott said, we could make some play with the fact that BPPs never had UK citizenship any more than African Ugandans, and that our responsibility has always been limited. But in order to avert responsibility for this group, in the event of an expulsion, what was needed was, and I quote Scott again, a fairly forthcoming attitude and acceptance into the UK of those whom we accept as UK citizens. So the realization that there is one group that can be left out of the equation already was a realization that occurred long before the expulsion. And so claims that the expulsion came out of the blue, that they were inspired by a dream of an erratic African leader, were already very popular at the time. We continue to hear them today, but they couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the expulsion was very much anticipated. Britain knew exactly what could happen, had a lot of contingency plans already in place, and also had certain strategies to deny responsibility. I'll go into some detail here. The first sign, of course, was what was happening in Kenya in 1968. In Kenya, they changed the Trade Licensing Act so that people without citizenship had lesser rights to trade, and if you lost your job, you had lesser right to citizenship, so it became this vicious circle. And many Kenyan Asians wanted to leave Kenya for that reason, and they were full citizens, so they could go to the UK. But the UK, in that same year, had changed citizenship laws, which made people from who were not belongers, as Professor Mamdani explained yesterday, let them queue before they could enter the country based on employment vouchers. And so these Kenyan Asians got stuck in Kenya, and Britain started to negotiate a deal with India in order to receive their kith and kin, as this was called at the time. This resulted into a power struggle with Indira Gandhi's government in India, who did not want to receive these people. She was having her own ideas about population restrictions, resulting in large-scale population control at the time. But in any case, she didn't want to receive the British Asian diaspora. And she also had an upper hand because she knew Britain was extremely reliant on Indian labor, especially in the NHS, where many doctors of Indian origin were going. Eventually, this led to a situation in which India and Britain agreed to share the burden. The compromise was that India would let in Kenyan Asians unrestricted, but in exchange for what was called an Indian endorsement, so that these Indians, even though they had chosen to go to India, could retain their British nationality and could migrate to the UK at a later stage if they wished to do so. Later, for the Ugandan Asians, this exact same agreement would return. But it wasn't only the Kenyan situation that prepared British policymakers. Uganda was already also for a long time in the planning phase of an expulsion. Obote was making very concrete plans for his own Trade Licensing Act, but also for rendering this large group of BPPs stateless. However, he did not act on it, and the British were very fearful that he would. So in 1971, one of the main reasons to support Amin's coup was exactly the fact that they feared that, they would be confronted with an Asian expulsion from Uganda. This was again a very clear sign of the power struggle that we had between the former colonizer and the former colonized. Here you see these East African countries really asserting some power. And so when Amin announced the expulsion order, or Decree 17, on the 4th of August 1972, this was not at all a surprise to the British government. And many systems were already in place that allowed the British to reduce their responsibility for large numbers of the Ugandan Asian population. But they couldn't, of course, act entirely unhampered. They were hampered by international law. They had acceded to human rights instruments regarding the prevention of statelessness, regarding freedom of movement, that obliged them to let people back into the country of their nationality. So there was absolutely no question, as Scott already knew in 1996, there was absolutely no question of shutting British citizens of Asian origin out. This was not possible. It would go against human rights law. It would lead to convictions in human rights courts. Britain would lose its humanitarian appeal, its moral obligations, its moral high ground. So that group was already secured. They knew already in the 60s that they would need to take them. So Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, had absolutely no choice, but then worked very hard, and I quote him, to seek to ensure that the world opinion was fully seized of the problem. What he wanted to do was making sure that the rest of the group would be dispersed as widely as possible. And when Amin proceeded with about this plan and very abruptly rendered 10,000 Asians stateless, the former BBPs, this actually presented a tremendous opportunity for the British government. Because now, with the stateless group, they could turn to a special UN agency responsible for the stateless, which was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The High Commissioner himself had some linkages with Uganda. Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan came from the Ismaili community, and therefore it's often assumed that he took the initiative and was very forthcoming in finding places for these people, but he actually wasn't. And we see this that in the resettlement of the Ismaili community to Canada from Tanzania, he did not get involved. And actually, he was very reluctant to get involved with the Ugandan Asians. The only way he could get involved was because there was a group of stateless Asians involved in it. But, and this is almost always forgotten, as long as people remained in Uganda, they could never count as refugees, because the 1951 Refugee Convention stipulates that a refugee can only be someone who's outside the country of his origin, being it nationality or habitual residence. Hence, what needed to happen was to find spots for these people to leave to go to, and Britain actually took up this task. So Britain immediately used the 3-month grace period installed by Amin to seek places for these people to resettle to, and started intense negotiations with over 50 countries. Of these countries, India, of course, was the most important, and they, but this time it even took more negotiations. And apart from the endorsement, they also had to give a lot of cash to the Indians to arrange for the resettlements. And then very important were Canada and Sweden, both countries with great humanitarian records. And Canada, being, of course, a very loyal British ally, was the first country to accept more than token numbers of Ugandan Asians. So it endorsed the resettlement as a humanitarian action, and it did this early on, and the British were very, very pleased to see this happening. Sweden came a little later, required more persuasion, but had an even higher humanitarian status, and was therefore very much welcomed to give the resettlement a humanitarian facade. And what was more, UNHCR then acted as the leading humanitarian agency and acted upon over 25 leads, countries who had promised in negotiations with Britain to provide spots during for the resettlement, ranging from Brazil to Iran, from Belgium to New Zealand, you name it, many countries across the world. And though these numbers were small, it was very important to work with a caseload of stateless Asians and to make sure that they had enough resettlement opportunities. In order for them to leave the country and to become refugees, UNHCR had to work with staging centers in Italy, Austria, Belgium, Spain, and Malta, which were necessary. Otherwise, these people could never become or attain the label of refugees. So what does this exactly have to do with neoliberalism then? As might be clear by now, the resettlement had the crucial function of reframing a post-colonial struggle for a redefinition of power balance into a humanitarian refugee crisis, right? Did this two things. It elevated the status of Britain as a global humanitarian actor, and it disenfranchised Amin's regime, but not only his regime, but also every single government in the global south wanting to deal with its former British Asian diaspora. And so every country seeking to dissolve the anomaly of a British diaspora could then be framed as a human rights violator or a humanitarian rogue client. But there is more. In the UK, an explicit theoretical neoliberal framework backed the entire operation. Already in 1968, the conservative MP Enoch Powell, then already a member of the infamous neoliberal think tank, the Mount Pelerin Society, proclaimed his neoliberal doctrine on migration in his Rivers of Blood speech. And contrary to what many people think, he did not oppose to immigration on sich. Enoch had been one of the architects of the Indian doctor immigration to the NHS, but he vehemently vexed out against the immigration of citizens of color. People with British passports who were not white, he feared would tip the balance of the electorate to the left. Enoch was expelled from the party by Edward Heath, but eventually he won the moral fight because he set in motion a system that seeks to avoid the permanent immigration of people who can become citizens. And here, of course, refugees are the first to become suspect because they relinquish their nationality often when they flee their countries and then seek to find new nationalities in their new destinations. Britain, over the course of the rest of the 20th century, very, very, very carefully avoided to take in refugees, but their stance has become, over the course of the 21st century, more and more widespread, you can say. And so unknowingly and unwillingly, UNHCR, but also the large resettlement countries, helped to install a system that would severely hamper their operations in the future, their resettlement operations in particular. But not before they tested it out once more in Vietnam, but I'll leave that for another paper as I have been warned that my time is running out. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was fascinating to think about the complexities of the law, of globalization, and contemporary refugee resettlement issues. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, Samuel Kisitu can't join us today, so we will turn to our final panelists this morning. And it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome Mr. Arif Virani, Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park, who is going to speak on the theme of competing conceptions of identity that characterize Ugandan Asians. And like many of the presenters at this conference, I don't think needs much of an introduction, but I will say that Mr. Virani came to Canada as a Ugandan Asian refugee. Before entering politics, he worked as a constitutional litigator, advocating for human rights and access to justice. He was an analyst with the Canadian Human Rights Commission in Ottawa, an investigator at the Commission des droits de la personne et des droits de la jeunesse in Montreal, and an assistant trial attorney prosecuting those accused of genocide at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Mr. Virani was also one of the founders of the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario in Toronto, and he is a member of the Redwood, a shelter for abused women and their children, and he regularly volunteers at the Parkdale Community Food Bank. And it is our tremendous pleasure to have you with us this morning, so thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I presume with Samuel not being here, I'm going to ask for maybe an additional 5 minutes or so, but you guys, I'll keep my eyes on the timekeeper. So I want to just acknowledge it's a pleasure to be speaking to you here at Carleton on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Je suis effectivement bilingue, donc si vous avez des questions plus tard en français, n'hésitez pas à poser-le parce qu'on peut vous répondre en français. I want to acknowledge Carleton. The work of Shazan and Heather in terms of this conference, but the stepping up of this institution to house the archive. That archive is something that is very meaningful to a lot of people in this room, a lot of people in this country, including my parents who have donated their own documents to that archive. And it's amazing to see yourself there. And I'll say very personally that I personally accessed the logbook and found the entry of my flight and my family on October 12th. Of 1972 in that logbook, which is quite an amazing thing. And then I shared it with people at Long Point, which I just visited 3 days ago. So the work you're doing is impactful, and I really, really venerate it. What I'm going to reflect on is, first of all, the previous two speakers were quite amazing, both in their own rights. I'm going to sort of walk you through sort of two parts. One is sort of my personal journey, but secondly, my professional journey as a parliamentarian, and touch on conceptions of identity all along that narrative. So let me start with sort of my personal journey. So like many in this room, like many you have heard of, the ancestry traces to Gujarat in India. There's about 3 generations of my family, 3 or 4, depending on which side of the family you're on, that are born in East Africa, in different parts of East Africa. So I have aunts and uncles that are from Kenya. My mother was born in Singida, Tanzania. My father, I, and my sister were born in Kampala, and subsequently made our way here. I was an infant when the expulsion order was made, right? So I come here, I know I look a bit young, but I'm actually 51 in about a week. So I was 10 and a half months old when we came, which prompted my son to ask my mother if she hid jewelry and cash in my diaper, because no goon would look for jewelry in a poopy diaper, according to my son, which is a good strategy, but my mom did not hide jewelry in my diaper. The family settled in Montreal, where we stayed for about 18 months, 24 months, and then we moved to Toronto. I think, I was trying to frame sort of this narrative in the context of sort of conceptions of identity. And I think if you had asked me who I was when I was young and in elementary school, I would have said, like most young newcomers, young immigrants, regardless of where you were from, I'm just Canadian. Or I desperately just wanted to be just Canadian, right? You just want to fit in. You want to not speak with an accent. You want to take peanut butter to school and not dal and rice. You want to not have people hear your parents' accent. You want to have them not see people eating with their hands, right? All of these things that are part of this sort of cultural sort of ostracism and this sort of a dysphoria that exists in the mind of a young child. And I think that was very, very common, right? I'm just Canadian. And it manifests even in terms of a journey of people's identity, in terms of, I'll use myself as an example in terms of names. I didn't want to be known as Arif. I didn't want to be known as Arif. Some of my classmates in grade 4 gave me a nickname, which relates to Varani, which was verb. And I just wanted to be known as verb, because that was just more easy to pronounce and just made me fit in. I think you then get to sort of middle school, or what we called junior high at the time, and you get to high school, and you start to age a little bit, and you become a bit wiser, a bit more mature, not much, but a little bit. And you start to think about sort of what you're hearing at the dinner table, what kind of music your parents are playing, who they're hanging out with. Lord knows I spent a lot of time with the Aga Khan cricket team, which my dad founded in Toronto in 1974. And there were all of his buddies from East Africa. There was not just Ugandans, there were Tanzanians and Kenyans, etc. But you start to understand and appreciate, you hear stories about matoke, about climbing trees for mango, all of these sort of idyllic images of East Africa, the pearl of Africa. And you start to connect. And there's a religious connection with the Ismaili community that I share with Shazan. And I think you start to identify at that point as, well, I'm from Uganda. My family is from Uganda. So I think there starts to be a bit of an evolution. The other thing that was very, very apparent, and it dovetails, and I'll come back to this with what both Sara and Shazan were talking about, were you not just heard about Uganda, but you heard about what caused us to leave Uganda. And I think part of the identity was definitely a demonization of Idi Amin, the butcher of East Africa, right? The cannibal the people who cost Asians their lives, but also costed hundreds of thousands of Black Africans their lives. And that very much resonated in terms of sort of my understanding of sort of why we were here, but also who sent us here, who's the reason why we're in Canada. And as I entered sort of university and in my 20s, I think even that started to evolve. And now I want to pepper my journey with some insights because they're sort of like signposts for me in terms of my own journey, in terms of identity. I went to McGill, so returning to Montreal. And after McGill, I did a parliamentary internship here in Ottawa on Parliament Hill. And I will always remember a conversation I had with a person who was what's called a congressional fellow. So we were parliamentary interns. We either sometimes visited foreign places or we received foreign visitors. So congressional fellows worked in Congress. They were sort of the ilk of about 35 to 50 almost. So they were sort of professionals in their own right. Parliamentary interns in Canada were sort of 20 to 25. So there I was, 23 years old, with a guy who's a military veteran. He's about 45. And we talked about me and sort of how I ended up here. And he turned to me and he said, Idi Amin's probably the best thing that ever happened to you. And I'd never heard somebody say that to me, let alone like an American soldier. And I recoiled in horror, because I'd been taught about Idi Amin. But it made me reflect on this conception of identity, which there's so many conceptions that Shazan put forward and Sara has been articulating. But it was a shift in the idea of identity from being a victim to being a benefactor. I think that was an important conception for me. I then, virtually the same year, I had the chance to go to Washington and I visited with one of my cousins, Sharon, who was a lawyer in Washington at the time. And I'm still about 23. And we talked about Uganda. And she encouraged me to think about it from the perspective of sort of a community that was passing through, as opposed to sort of a Ugandan sort of indigenous community in the legal sense of that term. But that we were Asians transplanted into Uganda. And that Uganda was actually a country of Black Africans, and to understand the colonialism that even brought us to Uganda. And that made me pause and think. And when I think about it now, Sharon's mother is Parsi from Bombay. One of my uncles had gone to Bombay for medical school and brought back a bride. And I think her understanding of India and the connection to India was a bit more direct than mine because of who her mother is. The evolution then sort of continues to occur when I have some time between articling and between law school and articling. I go to law school in Toronto, and then between articling and between starting my articles and finishing law school, I took 8 months to travel. And I went to India and I did an internship on caste discrimination. I went to East Africa and I visited the homeland, and then I went to the Middle East. And in sort of retracing that voyage, I think I learned a heck of a lot. I sort of prepared for that trip to understand sort of the ancestral roots in places like Veraval, Somnath, Rajkot, in western Gujarat, a place called Saurashtra. And it really opened my eyes to India and its legacy, but also a sense of racial awareness in East Africa. And I saw firsthand when I went to Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, and I saw firsthand some of the struggles that still exist between Black and brown communities in East Africa. And I don't think we can have a direct conversation about conceptions of identity without addressing the elephant in the room, right? That as barbaric as the edict was, it was fueled by a sense of economic deprivation, racial difference that was, white, brown, Black in that order. In many parts of Africa, and that's what people were revolting against. I also remember a very candid conversation I had with Black Africans in Uganda who said, welcome. In previous times they would have said Karibuni, but then I realized no one spoke Swahili anymore because Swahili was the language of Amin's oppressors. But they said welcome. But, when you got people talking, they said, it's interesting that you and your community are being invited back by the IMF, and Museveni is being told to bring you back and restart business and restart that middle-class economy. No one rolled out the red carpet for us. And what he was talking about is that I was a Black African. I had to get the hell out. I fled to Congo. I fled to Rwanda. When I came back, there was no red carpet. There's no incentive to take back property, etc. And that made me really think about that racial tension and that difference in identity. I know this is going to sound like a bit of a joke, but there was an instance back in Canada where there's a Finn, a Ugandan, and a cop, and we're on a ski hill. But this is true. One of my best friends growing up is a Finnish guy, And I'm back from this trip, and it's sort of the early 2000s, and we're literally on a ski hill at Whistler, and we're in a gondola. And when you're in a gondola for 6-8 minutes, you just chat with whoever's in the gondola. And the conversation came up, as Shazan said, about people's identity and where they're from. And the cop asked me where I was from, and I said, well, I'm a Ugandan of Indian ancestry. And my friend Yuha, after we got off the thing, he said, I've never heard you ever associate yourself with India before. Because he grew up with me from the age of about 7 to 20, always saying I'm Ugandan. And you see that evolution starting to happen. And the evolution starts to happen with one's name, right? So I try and drop verb. It's not very professional. I'm a lawyer now, so I'm trying to be called Arif. I think the evolution came full tilt for me when I married into an Indian family. So my wife is born in St. John's, Newfoundland, but her parents are from Uttar Pradesh. Right, she's not Ismaili, she's of the Jain background, which is a very non-violent religion and very ancient religion in India. But, our marriage ceremony, our cultural touchstones, the music, everything sort of starts connecting me more and more with India. My wife and I then work in India for a year and work in East Africa for a year prior to having babies and having a mortgage. And I think the evolution really starts to become sort of complete for me. But the time when we worked in East Africa, going back to this issue about racial tensions and how that informs identity, I'll tell you quite candidly, we spent a lot of time when we lived in Arusha, as you had mentioned, Lisa, that I worked with the UN on the War Crimes Tribunal. There was the professional work, but on the personal side, my wife and I spent a long time repeatedly explaining to black Tanzanians that we were Indians from Canada and not local Indians. And the reason why that was important is because there was still so much tension between brown and black in Tanzania that has its roots in 60 years of economic deprivation. And that became a big eye-opener, a really big eye-opener. So now I'm a dad of 2 little boys, the one I mentioned who talked to my mom about the diapers. And those little boys, what we're trying to do is really focus in on sort of who they are and trying to teach them the way any parents are trying to teach them. And I think in teaching them, the language classes aren't in Luganda or aren't in Swahili, they are in Hindi, right? We're trying to teach them a bit about their Indian ancestral roots. It's a work in progress. But I'll tell you that now, I think Shazan, you mentioned situational identity. This 50th anniversary has had a big impact on me, on my family, and just thinking about it and reading about it and learning about it. Hearing what Sara just said had a big impact on me, that people are talking about the notion of an expulsion as early as 68 or 69, that it wasn't a sudden issue. But it's made me just think hard about the Ugandan connection. And I said quite publicly a couple of days ago that I'm taking my kids and my wife to Uganda to teach them about the land of East Africa, to teach them about where I was born, where I took my first breath, where multiple generations of my family are from, because I think that's part of who I am, and it will always be part of who I am. So to finish on this personal part, I don't know whether I'm Ugandan, whether I'm Canadian, whether I'm Indian. I am some confluence of all three. And I think it very much depends on whom you're talking to and when you're talking. I'm intensely grateful to Canada for the safety and the opportunity that this country has provided me, that you take a child in diapers who's a refugee and you turn him into a human rights lawyer and a parliamentarian. That's an amazing story about this country. And that story deserves to be told, and Canada needs to know that it's an amazing story. I have a native connection to Uganda, but I'll say to you that it's also troubled, because when I think about it and reflect on it, what happened back then, and Sara canvassed this, it was a huge humanitarian disaster. It was a human rights problem that happened 50 years ago. And when you want to reconcile with Uganda and you want to reconnect with Uganda, you can't help but look at the human rights problem that is right now in that country. It is effectively punishable by death, if not life imprisonment, to be gay or lesbian in Uganda right now. That's a problem. So how do you reconcile an ancient human rights violation with a current human rights gigantic issue? Right? There's a tension there. You can say the same about India. It's not exactly as if it's a particularly friendly place for Muslims in terms of law or practice on the ground in India right now. There's tensions, right? And I don't mean to be naive about it, but that creates some barriers in terms of the identity equation. And if you say in terms of, again, my naming nomenclature, I'll tell you it's really coming full circle, because, some of my parliamentary colleagues will hear Ismailis come by to Parliament and they'll say, well, why are they calling you Arif? You told me your name is Arif. And I say to them, because most white folks can't pronounce arif, and I'm not a guitar riff, right, from a song. But there, the nomenclature changes again, and as you change the nomenclature, you change one's concept of identity, because it is properly arif. It means one who knows in Arabic. And it's quite a nice name, as my wife always tells me. So she said, use it. So you try, but you still struggle. In terms of lessons learned, I'm getting a sign for 5 minutes, and I know it's already 15 minutes, so I'll go a little bit faster here. But I think some of the things that I wanted to say about lessons learned from my parliamentary perspective are that the Ugandan resettlement exercise for Canada and the lessons learned are directly applicable to stuff that we've worked on as a country, that I've worked on personally. In 2015, I'm appointed by Justin Trudeau as the Parliamentary Secretary to John McCallum. We are in the midst of settling 25,000 Syrian refugees immediately. We end up settling over 50,000. At IRCC, at the briefings that I was a part of, they were taking direct lessons learned from Uganda and from the Vietnamese exercise. So how to do it, how to charter planes, what we need to do, how many people on the ground, which countries people need to be in, was all directly applicable. What's also directly applicable on a personal note is that I made a point when I was there on December 10th, 2015 at Pearson, when we received that first charter flight. I was with McCallum and with the Prime Minister and a few other cabinet ministers, and I made a point of finding a family of Syrians that had a young child. And the child that I saw was about a 14-month-old girl baby. And through an interpreter, because my Arabic is bad, I spoke to them about, welcome, you are safe. And you saw the relief wash over them. And for some people, like for my family, it was their first flight ever. But I also said to them, you are home, and understand that Canada is a land of opportunity. I was once that baby in your arms. I became a lawyer, and now I'm a member of Parliament welcoming you to Canada. That is what Canada is about. And it was emotional. It was emotional for them. It was emotional for me. It took some time to register for people to understand and comprehend, but then something started to click. And the reason I raise that is because, it goes to what Sara was talking about, legal issues. I'm very proud of the 50,000 plus that we brought in. But one thing that people don't realize is that at the airport, we had SIN cards available for people, and we had permanent resident cards available immediately. God bless Angela Merkel in Germany and what they did. 1 million people were brought in. It took 3 years for some of those people to get permanence in that country. Many did end up getting permanence, but our permanence was immediate. And the reason I raise this is because it goes to the conceptions of identity. I don't know whether 6 years on, Syrians are saying, I'm Syrian, maybe they're saying I'm Syrian Canadian, maybe they're saying I'm Canadian. But I do know that you can put in place policies and practices as a government to ensure people's attachment to a country is formed immediately by ensuring they have legal status in a country. And I think that's really, really critical to point out. Right? I think I'll just raise 2 other examples really quickly, Lisa. But in terms of conceptions of identity, I also think that they evolve over time. And I'll give you another example. In 1985, the Air India disaster occurs. It's June, I believe, of 1985. Brian Mulroney is the Prime Minister. One of his first acts was to call India and offer condolences to the Indian Prime Minister about the deaths of Indians. For those of you who know what happened, there were about 200 plus Canadian citizens on that flight. But yet the conception in 1985 is that that's other. They're on their way to India. Those are Indians. We're going to apologize to a foreign nation about the deaths of Indians. Fast forward to a year and a half ago, Ukrainian Airlines is shot down over Tehran by the Iranian regime. Justin Trudeau acknowledges those are 75 Canadians that are on board. Right? And I don't mean to pedestal one prime minister over the other. I just mean to say that there's a conception that evolves over time. And to the Prime Minister Trudeau's credit, he was including permanent residents in that grouping because those are all Canadians. It wasn't Iranians that died, it was Canadians that died. And I think that's important in terms of political leadership and vernacular. And the last thing I'll end on, and I promise I'll end right here, is there's this notion about multiculturalism and diversity. So you can say that creates both a push and a pull. I very much am a devout believer in a policy that was announced by Pierre Trudeau in 1971 that became law in 1988. People decry it and say, no, you're creating hyphenated Canadians. You're making that a Syrian Canadian. You're labeling yourself as a Ugandan Canadian as opposed to just a Canadian. I believe that we actually, by lifting up those differences, we're actually developing our polity and our pluralism. And I very much believe that, I think the Aga Khan said this the first time I heard it, which is that diversity is a fact. which means that you can have multiple languages spoken in Toronto or so many religions practiced in Canada. But pluralism is an active choice. And the choice is not just to tolerate difference, but to celebrate difference and to uplift it. And I think that's what we do in Canada, and I think that's to our betterment as a nation. And that feeds into these conceptions of identity, where it allows the multiple identities that Shazan mentioned in his opening to actually flourish in one not feeling conflicted. So I'll end there because my time is up, but I look forward to a great conversation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much for that incredibly moving and powerful presentation. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. I think this, the conversation this morning in terms of identity, sorry, behind the podium there, you know, in terms of how we see ourselves, how others see us, whether that be states, humanitarians, citizens, neighbors, colleagues. Am I? Oh, Samuel is here. Oh, here, I was doing some wrap-up comments, but this is wonderful. We have Samuel.
Yeah, let's do it. Why not?
Okay.
So one of our other presenters, Samuel, has just made it. So we're going to give him an opportunity to speak if he's ready to go right away.
Shouldn't have given me the extra 5 minutes.
So I will just say, everyone, that there, you know, the coffee break is not being sacrificed. That there will be coffee and refreshments, but this is such a rich conversation. And Samuel, welcome. I will stand up. Sorry, I was being lazy there. How are you, Samuel? You're good? So it's my great pleasure to welcome Samuel Kisitu, who's a student at the University of Toronto, a philanthropist and an avid advocate for social and economic justice and equitable access to health, affordable housing, immigration status, and decent work in minority and racialized communities. And we're very much looking forward to your comments this morning, and I believe you'll be speaking on the theme of beyond finding a home in the promised land, Canada, moving towards reconciliation and reconnections for Uganda and for the Ugandan diaspora. And we've had such a rich conversation in terms of identities, legal identities, cultural identities. And so, Samuel, we're very much looking forward to your comments.
Yeah, habari. Musibe mtiano basebo ne banyabo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Samuel Kisitu. I want to open this conversation with these words. Boba omanyi jova, oboba omanyi woli, ngomanyi jova, ero omanyi jolaga. These are Luganda words. I am Samuel Kisitu. I come from Uganda, from the Leuven Triangle. They literally mean in English that if you know who you are, where you are coming from, then you know where you are going. So we all know how life has put us in different places, but love is bringing us back home, and that is powerful. This has been a complex conversation, complex topic, like the complexes we are really handling from way back before Uganda got independence. And to me as a scholar, and I mean, I tried so much to find my position in this. So you may expect much, but this is what I have for you. Reading an article on the RAND blog by Nathaniel, written by Nathaniel Allen and Alexander Noyes. It was written in September 16th, 2019. African dictators have been losing power, some to democratic governments, but the military can tip the scales towards democracy. From the second paragraph I want to quote, yet the end of one dictator does not necessarily prevent the rise of another one. Today we are here because of one dictator, Idi Amin. But let the history and writers not forget there is another dictator called Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. And that is how I come into this conversation. Yes, the end of Idi Amin led to the rise of the world's longest serving dictator, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, to rise to power. Museveni made the Luwero Triangle his battlefield. Luwero is my home, from Kanyanda, along Semto Road, leading to numerous loss of lives, property, and displacement of people, including my own family members. I want to recall the death of late Lubwama Livingston, a brother to my uncle, who was murdered, and he had to make the family's dream about where he was murdered because he was connected to Museveni, because our family was connected to Museveni, helping him in different ways of support as civilians really helped Museveni to come to power. So the family of late Kisitu Elsania may not be recorded anywhere in history, but that is the family where I come from, and I am a grandson. So my father is late Setimba Ronald, and that's who we are. That's who I am. We are so many, but I come to represent masses. The numbers of Railroad Triangle were so much more. Like one life matter, really. I don't want to underestimate the statement that we have the traumas we are dealing with as the Ugandan Indians or Asians. But I want to tell you that there were real death and skulls which should be recalled, which we have really we have to nurse those wounds. Late Roma Livingstone left widows and orphans, my brothers, and my family. And I want to say this. If my father had died in the war that brought Museveni to power, I wouldn't be here today. The war ended in 1986. I was born in 1989, on November 11th. Yes, it matches with the Remembrance Day of Canada. To me, when we remember the veteran, we remember the soldiers, the heroes who fought the World War I, the World War II. My heart goes to the civilian veterans of Luwero who dying in support of a liberator of then, who has become the world's brutalist leader today. So, that is a betrayal by my leader. That is a betrayal of the blood which was shed to cause Uganda to become independent, to cause Uganda to be liberated from Obote regime, the Amin regime, the Tito Okello Lutwa, and all such. Yesterday, we had a conversation. We had really a rich conversation from a very respectable man in this world called Professor Mamdan. He asked a question that, is there a place for Asians in today's Uganda? That's the question, and it's our homework, all of us. But I want to add you another homework. I think Professor Samuel Ruanga, Dr. Samuel Ruanga Lunyago, in his book, Uganda, an Indian Colony, Professor Samuel tried to answer the questions. If you can go and read that book. I have a few minutes here. Also, the NTV television, the NTV television's Panorama featured a Uganda and Indian colony book words in two subjects of commerce, politics, culture wars. all that references for us to visit. I also ask, is there a place for Ugandans, what you might call Ugandan Indians? I mean, Ugandan indigenous in today's Museveni's Uganda? That's the question I also want to ask, and maybe it can be homework. Is there a place for Ugandan indigenous in today's Museveni's Uganda? There's a big population in Toronto of people who have been fleeing, who have fled from Uganda, and we want to appreciate Canada for hosting us again and again. From, we can say from Idi Amin, when he lost power, all his enablers did not find space. They had to run. Talk about the Tito Okero Lutwa, talk about the Yusuf Lule, talk about Obotetu. Now, Museveni has more than 35 years in power. I have 33, I made 33 on November 11th, just days ago. I'm writing a paper on the theme, investigating the legacy, understanding the Ugandan Asian refugee resettlements, impacts, and further migration from East Africa. The aim of this paper is to explore practices that mitigate growing divides, and address wounds of colonialism and break the cycles of trauma through building reconciliation and reconnection in home countries and host countries. We talk about Canada, we talk about Uganda. So, as a young scholar, I found it really, I had like to read much books to come up with this, but I say that let me come with the little I have as of now. I got lucky. I shared a story in the Toronto Star. I disinfected the subways, helped the disabled, and worked as a personal support worker. And this story was written by Jennifer Young of the Toronto Star. I would like you to read it when you find time. Although housing, immigration status, and working conditions, they all combine to put us, temporary workers, newcomers, and other vulnerable groups at risk. Sara Mozededa made that tweet. But Andrea Howarth, you know her, she's a Canadian politician who is a mayor of Hamilton, tweeted, I quote, "An incredible story of care and heroism. Samuel Kisitu was a hero to Sharon Ogilvie, her daughter, Erica, and the family. PSWs like Samuel deserve so much better from the government than they have got. Let's start with full-time hours, paid sick days, and a permanent pay increase." As Casenio performs a poem knocking with the wounds of colonialism and breaking cycles of trauma, here I am. I come with the words decolonizing peace. And I would like the one who is handling the slides to give us that short video so you can get my strategy of walking the journey of decolonizing peace. She came with her poem of Decolonizing Love, which you must read. Oh, I don't command, which I suggest for you to read, but I come with decolonizing peace with this video. Do you mind really having that video? It can't come. Okay. It can't come. Oh, I shared.
Is it in the slide deck?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, no worries. Keep going.
Okay, yeah. As that video is coming, we have a big question. Where do we go from here? What is next for all of us? Now, I would like to invite you to this call to action. That as we have been talking about homelessness, I mean, we talked about home and homeland. I want to assure you that homelessness is one thing that goes with the newcomers here in this place. I came here in 2019, and I still see I've been a victim of homelessness, which I wanted you to see in the video, but I want to tell you that cutting the long story short, I have a call to action. And this is a call to understand the communities that host us, to respect and appreciate the communities, whether the mosque or the church. Personally, I reached to the point of fear when I just came to Canada. In fact, one of the parts that I had to really throw light on is how the Indian Asians really integrated quickly, and then how, like comparing, during comparisons of how we are doing it, how do we really survive. I shared with the Professor Michael, and he told me of really him being executive, the deputy director of the team that helped in securing or evacuation of of our brothers and sisters in this room. He told me about the agents which was there and the absentia of non-profit organization. I think it was like there was a centralized, like a kind of, there was a centralized, according to my conversation with him and in the interview, there was a centralized organization which was really called, which was really handling all the matters. And there were complexes in really understanding the details because they needed personalized approach. The languages, the cultures, the food, the ABCD that really make somebody to be human and not dehumanized or brought to less. And let's appreciate Canadian government, which is really investing a lot of money in Ontario Works today and other non-profit organizations which are helping in sort of resettling newcomers from the specific groups, whether Jewish community, whether the Asian community, the Ugandan community, which is so lagging behind. And I want to say that we have this call to action as I have 1 minute. We want to build the first multi-purpose community center in Toronto. With the 50-bed youth shelter, a recreation facility of around 300 people capacity, child care facility, counseling hub to continue nursing our mental health challenges, the traumas we go through, the repression after repression, and a place of worship for all denominations and affiliations. So that is the call to action. I am sure that I am in front of people who decide things to be, and that is a score. In fact, in my conclusion, I want to say the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a statement on the 50th anniversary of the Ugandan Asian resettlement, honoring the resilience, strength, and courage of Ugandans of South Asian descent, and reflecting on the many important contributions they have made and continue to make to Canadian communities according to the country. Across the country. So based on last year's statement by the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, honoring the 50 years anniversary of Canadian multicultural policy, in his statement on the Canadian immigration and the multiculturalism policy that has paved a way of acceptance of South Asians from Uganda, really can become part of the Ugandan Canadian fabric to foster sisterhood and brotherhood, to rewrite our history and leave the legacy we want our children and grandchildren to find a new Uganda that works for all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That was a really wonderful way to connect contemporary issues, matters of the heart, and questions of home and place. And so thank you very much for sharing your stories and your ideas with us. I think we'll take about 10 minutes for questions and answers. I'm shortening things a little bit. Then we'll have a short coffee break and try and come back for 11 for the next panel. Does that make sense? Roughly? Okay, we're going to see how it goes. But we, with such a rich panel, we don't want to compress things too much in terms of questions and comments. So there are 2 microphones in the room. If you do have a question or comment for any of the panelists, including Sara, who's still online, I believe, please come to the mic and introduce yourself and share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Zulfikar. I wanted to I have a question for Sara, and then kind of a question for maybe some of the other panelists here. I wanted to just help understand, you talked about the idea of this kind of neoliberal reconfiguration at 64 in Zanzibar, when there was another kind of expulsion of so-called Arabs from the island. And at that time, Zanzibar was also a protectorate. So I just wanted to ask if you see this kind of issue actually preceding even that moment of 1968 that you described, and I wanted to see if there's any connection that can be made between those. Oftentimes left out of the equation is the response of Britain to that expulsion as well, accepting the Sultan but not accepting the people that were identified as Arab. And only as a caveat to that, I wanted to just say that those communities were part of the East African coast since the 8th century. So, to see these configurations as confined in time, I'm just wondering whether our view actually maybe need to be longer than just simply the colonial moment, the specific colonial moment, and thinking about imperialism. The other question I have for the rest of the panelists is what Samuel was talking about. Where do we go from here? And I was thinking about an op-ed I put in the Globe and Mail some years ago, where I called for Canadian educators, especially schools, to start telling stories in their curriculum of immigration experiences that were not part of the history books. I wrote that article in response to my son coming to me and saying, we studied the medieval period and I said, where is that? And he said, oh, that's in Britain. So I'm just, as a kind of a question for me about, we're having this wonderful conversation today. We've been having it for 50 years. But today's school curriculum, as many of you know, is still a colonial and settler colonial curriculum. So where do we intervene to be able to tell Samuel's story, to tell my story, to tell some of your stories as a structured part of the curriculum. Because the reason why we're having this conference today is because these stories are not integrated into school curricula, and it's only when kids get to university that they might happen to take a course which speaks to some of these issues. I think that's a continuation of the colonial project. To remake Canada truly is to structurally integrate Canadians of all varieties and their histories into the story of Canada, and that is not happening today. It's taken years for Indigenous people to have their stories told. Will it take another 50 years for our stories to be integrated and our kids not to feel like they're outsiders? It's a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sara, do you want to start with a response to the question, and then we'll turn it over to the panelists? It's a big question about where we go from here.
I can start. Zulfikar, thank you so much for your question. It's a very good one, I think. And I think you're totally right that we need to think about longer timelines, because this isn't purely a colonial story, but it is a story about global transformation. And I must be very honest with you, I don't know much about the expulsion in Zanzibar in 1964. I'm a little bit of an odd one here. I think I'm not a specialist in South Asian studies or anything like that, or Indian Ocean studies for that matter. All the other panelists took the time to explain how they came to the topic, and that was quite obvious. But for me, it is actually quite a strange story. I am a historian of migration history, and I am specialized in the Belgian Sikh community, which is located in my home province. And when I was doing my investigations, I found out that the first Sikhs in Belgium were from Uganda, and I couldn't figure out why. Like, why would you come to Belgium if you're Ugandan Asian and Sikh and have all these connections to the Commonwealth and to the UK in particular? And so that's how I got very specialized in Ugandan Asians. And then, as Laura already said, did some research into the Chileans and the Vietnamese in the same period. So I'm not familiar with that story, but it's definitely something to look into. And I would invite everyone at the conference to make these new connections and to figure out the longer timelines, because I think the longer timelines are very, very, very informative of where we can go next. Because if we can imagine different pasts, and that taps into your other question, like, as long as we're not educated about these things and we cannot imagine other pasts, we can also not imagine other futures. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sara. Harif, do you want to take up the question of where we go next?
Well, first of all, I'm very curious about the Belgian Sikh community. If you could have chole bhatura and Belgian chocolate at the same time, I think I'm visiting Belgium soon. But Zulfikar, it's a great question. I'll say to you that, first of all, as public service announcement, on Monday, we passed in Parliament a unanimous consent motion about the Ugandan Asian exodus and what it has meant for Canada in terms of contributing to our development as a nation. That's important, and it's important because we rarely agree, all 5 parties and 2 independents, on anything. But I'll say to you that one of the things that we struggle with as elected representatives is that that is a tremendous idea. We can try and establish best practices at the federal level, but obviously provincial jurisdiction over education sort of governs the land. But I'll give you an example, Zulfikar, of one community that has done great strides to promote education through intensive lobbying and advocacy. I happen to represent several thousand Ukrainian Canadians in my riding. They have promoted awareness about an event called the Holodomor, which is a famine-induced genocide by Stalin depriving Ukrainians of wheat in 1932, 1933. They've created something called the Holodomor bus that literally travels around Ontario and now travels around Alberta and has become part of the curriculum effectively and de facto in places like Ontario in Alberta. I think what we need to do as a community of all faiths, stripes, and backgrounds and races from Uganda is, if we want to really seize an issue like this, is we need to sort of develop the material and then try to really get in the ears, particularly of provincial representatives, about why it's critical that this penetrates at that sort of grade 1 to grade sort of 12 level, because that's where the sort of the learning needs to happen. So I just thought I'd share that with you. Thank you.
Samuel, you asked the question. I don't know, Shazan, do you want to Do either of you want to pick?
Other questions, but I'd love to hear from Samuel if he has something to say.
Why don't we collect, I see there are 2 more questions, and I am very cognizant of time. I don't know if anyone else's belly is growling, but this is such a rich conversation. So let's collect as many questions as we can, and then we'll give all the panelists a chance to comment, if that's okay. So I think...
Thank you all for your presentations. And I'm sorry, I came in the middle, Shazan, of your presentation, so I don't know if you touched upon this. But
Oh, sorry, could you just introduce yourself, please?
my name's Ome.
Thank you.
And I grew up in Toronto, but I'm living in South Carolina now. So that's, I don't want to say I'm from the States because that's ridiculous. I'm Canadian. And, you know, and I guess my question is a bit premised on this. In America, I'm very Canadian, right? But this, and I want to premise it in saying that this is not a critique of the conference, but there is, I think the whole 50th anniversary celebration or commemoration is really premised on Canada, some sort of heroic state, on Canadian exceptionalism. We really do tout our multiculturalism in ways of welcoming and you know, and RFI was just very much, and I know the scrutiny on you is higher than probably anyone else in this room, so I don't expect that you will answer this question, but you know, when you were like, we need to think of present day human rights violations in India, you know, thinking of the countries that are part of this conversation, in India, in Uganda, you left out one country, Canada, right? It is, and you said it was literally a death sentence to be gay in Uganda. It is literally a death sentence to be Indigenous in this country, right? Confined within this nation state. Thank you. So how do we bring that into the conversation? And, you know, I'm thinking of Salima's presentation yesterday, where it's the second generation, I guess what they call this is 1.5, right? I was born in Dar, but, you know, grew up here in terms of this kind of ambivalent relationship with the nation state, with the Canadian nation state, right? My dad, some of you met him yesterday, gets very mad when I criticize Canada. I used to do community radio. He's like, don't say that on the radio. Like, there's this, like, you know, like, reverence to Canada, reverence to Trudeau. I mean, you know, I know you all know what I'm talking about, right? The first Trudeau, and this one, right? I've convinced my parents to vote NDP. But I guess this is why, like, what do we do as the second generation, you know, who are not, you know, who don't have allegiance to the state of Canada, but I will never give up my Canadian citizenship. You know, people ask me if I'm going to become American. Hell no. I like Canada. Like, so that's a tension within us too, right? And we're also, I have not heard one person talk about, and I know I'm talking a lot, about model minority status. Like, it's such a simple concept. And we talk about how Ugandan Asians, and I think it's explicitly a Ugandan Asian thing. Like, I'm from Tanzania, Kenyans too, right? Like these very high achieving, you know, but that is definitely the model minority myth. Like, there is nothing special about us. There is nothing unique about us. We have come to this country with some of us have come to this country already with certain privileges. And I think we see that within the Syrian community too. Not so much the Black Somali community. I don't know about more recent, I guess, refugee communities. You know, so just saying that as an example, that there are refugee communities who have not achieved what Ugandan refugees have. So if you could address that, if not. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot of really rich questions and comments, so we'll get to that. And then, yes?
I'll just maybe echo the question in a slightly different way, because when you were...
Oh, sorry, can you introduce
Sorry,
yourself?
Shafali,
Thank you,
from
Shafali.
U of T, sorry. Especially for Arif Nourani's, when you were talking about handing out social insurance cards and ID cards to the Syrians who came, I mean, one is really struck by the difference between that experience and what happens with these 1 million people in the queue and temporary foreign workers. And, you know, these communities that Samuel and other temporary workers represent. I think there is a real issue about the sort of timelines, and, you know, we were in a time of more generous welfare state when the Ugandans arrived in '72 versus this very harsh neoliberal environment today. And since you did speak as a parliamentarian, I'm going to ask you, like, what's the government doing about getting social insurance cards for these large numbers of people who are coming now, right?
Are there any last questions or comments from the audience? Because we will turn it over. Okay. There are. I've lost control of time. So Heather, you're just gonna have to tell me what's happening in terms of the schedule.
You can skip my question. I'm
Oh,
gonna
no,
ask
no,
it,
no,
but you
no,
can-
no,
You don't
please.
have, because it's only
No.
for two of them.
Just introduce yourself, please.
I'm Salima.
Thank you.
So it's a question for Shezan and Arif, because I'm curious. Obviously, my area of interest is how religion intersects with these issues. And so I'm curious about, so it's a bit of a two-pronged question. One, in your personal experience, in your research for Shezan, I think are for you in your life, the degree to which religious identity plays into the way you think about sort of your personal identity in this sort of mix of things. And two, I think this broader question, I think for both of you, which still concerns me, about why we don't include that category when we have these conversations, when within the community, at least as far as the Smileys are concerned, that is a big piece of the conversation. So why is it that when we come into these more secular spaces, we drop it? And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that, because I think it complicates the issue, or at least nuances it in ways that sometimes we don't make space for in academic spaces. Okay.
Thank you very much. And last question.
My name's Zane. My question hopefully only gets a few words as an answer, which is now currently, how do you introduce yourself and your background? You mentioned, Arif, that before you used to say Ugandan, Canadian, then Ugandan from Indian descent. Just wondering what you say now for both you and Shez. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We'll turn it over to the panelists. Who would like to go first? Samuel, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Here is it. Here's my lens of the things. Trying to answer. I've forgotten the name. The last speaker. Now here is where we have like to harmonize our complexes or our difficulties. The wounds of colonialism, one of them is really making my God a small God and a Satan, and making the other God of the Bible the true God that we all have to appreciate, whether he's there or not. But I want to tell you the realities on humanity, Ubuntu, humanity, being who, like of humanity, I am because you are. As the video of Mist, I'm going to just, use it to answer you that I fled Uganda in 2019, and months later, we had the pandemic. I fled in 2019. And as much as I was looking for a home to find a space, sometimes I slept in a church. Why I care about this community center to be built, as much as I may not believe in this God, but the church helped me to find accommodation when I had issues with my landlord. So, from there, I had to find work by force because I needed to now rent and have a place I call my own. I am a teacher from Uganda, teaching fine art in secondary schools, but I didn't get a chance to teach here. I had to do jobs I never wanted, including PSW. But you see how a hard time brings a good time, and that is what we call a testimony. That's where the good faith really comes in, and then we say, yeah, God did it. I went to Stratford to work in a long-term care, and as I was working, doing my job, one of the clients, this old woman really called for help. I came in. I found slow music, like harmonized music, not really music, hymns, for me to understand that, hey, she's a Christian. I am too. I was like, I never find such music. She was crying. She had spent hours, with a lot of complexes. Not eating, very, 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 she was in the hardest time. I can't really repeat her situation. But what I did to relate with her, I asked her her name. She told me her name is Sharon. But right away, I felt what you can call anything, if it's not God, the voice of God. If it's not the voice of God, it can be anything. But I felt the message that call her shalom. And the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. I didn't know that she had earlier had a prayer with her daughter calling for peace. She had given up with this thing called life because of what pain she was in for the number of time the time I can't tell. And me helping her, clean her, try to make her eat was not enough. A prayer with her really covered her wounds, healed her. I prayed with her, but I didn't know what happened next. When I went out, she called she called her daughter, and her daughter thought there's a problem. This time it's not a problem. The mother told her daughter, Erica, Ricky, there came an angel in my room. Not like an angel, a black stranger. He comes from Africa. He comes from Uganda. His name is Samuel. He has prayed with me and changed my name to Shalom. I feel the peace in me. Days later, this lady died. But Erica, what we really can call God or faith, the story, when I was really, when my shifts were cancelled and I went to find justice for myself, I went to the news. I found the writer and I told her this story, that this is what is happening on the front lines. She published the story in March 2021, and see how the story saturated, the article saturated until it reached the family where Sharon was mentioned. They knew this is the Samuel we were looking for. They were not settled. They came to say an appreciation. Guys, if you are not appreciated there are people who appreciate the services we do, even if you're not seen or not celebrated. The family came to appreciate me, but he came to appreciate all PSWs and all frontline workers who worked in the pandemic. We had this gathering at church, and we really celebrated God, in this case, the God who, the reconnection. So I really want to say that where is your human connection? Where is your personal connection with that spirit, which might be God? That will answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. I've confirmed the schedule now. There are 4 minutes left. So Arif and then Shazan.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Arif. Maybe we'll try and do it in 1 minute. Our next panel actually starts at 11:10.
What's happening to coffee?
That one, we're going to have to do a really quick, just in and out, grab something and come back. Because our next panel is all virtual, so we've delayed them another 30 minutes.
Gotcha. Yes, I haven't forgotten that Sarah's online. So here's the plan, everyone. Arif is going to speak a couple of minutes. Sara, if you have a very quick final comment, and then we're all going to run for coffee and we're all going to run back. Is everyone feeling energized with this plan? I'm so sorry. I'm so glad we're doing everything. We're going to do it all. Arif, we're looking forward to your comments.
Thanks. So, Ome, certainly not an intention to pedestal this country. There are warts in every country. Obviously, the Indigenous experience is the most pressing wart. It's a colonial wart. It's existed for 400 years. I'll tell you quite personally that all of my background as a human rights lawyer and all of my personal lived experience did not prepare me for when I worked on Indigenous language preservation and protection, which I did as Parliamentary Secretary to Melanie Joly, because it was an eye-opener. And I've said quite publicly many times, and I'll say it again, that you can't address basic human rights concerns amongst many populations in this country without understanding the foundational problems, which are the legacy of colonialism and oppression and racism fomented against Indigenous people. In terms of model minority status, I think you and I should have a conversation offline. It's a longer discussion. Sherfali, I think the immigration system is always under strain I don't know where Sherfali went. There she is. It's always under strain. I think there's continually tensions. Those were exacerbated, obviously, during the pandemic. But I'll be candid with you in saying I still remain quite proud when I see what we're trying to do as a country, especially as it compares to the rest of the planet. And one thing I wanted to say in the opening is about in a world where there's a continually retrenchment of borders and closing of borders, particularly in times of economic hardship, like the recession we're about to enter. I'm quite happy that we're about to accept 1.5 million people over the next 3 years. Can we process people faster? Can we eliminate some of the queues? Yes, we have to and we need to. And that's something that we're continuing to work on and I'm continuing to work on. In terms of Salima, it's a great question. I think I think it depends very personally on sort of your own level of religious conviction within your own family. I'll say to you as a parliamentarian, I tend to associate myself more and more as a Muslim. Given sort of the legacy of the previous government and what I disliked about some of the policies like barbaric cultural practices, hotlines, bans on hijabs at citizenship ceremonies, given the Islamophobia we've seen turn into violence against Muslims with the Afzal family in London, the Quebec City Mosque. I'm a proud member of the Muslim caucus. If we had an Ismaili caucus, there'd be only two of us. It's myself and Talib. But that's the general sort of identity piece. And Zain, I'll say to you right now that the way I identify is if people probe, there's Zain. I say my ancestry is in Gujarat. I came from Uganda as a Muslim refugee. And that's how I introduce myself now. Thank you very much. Miss you.
Thank you so much. Shazan, do you want to, were you a conference organizer where you're like, I'm not going to?
No, let's Sarah go.
Okay, Sarah, do you have some final comments for us? I think you have about 30 seconds at this point.
No final comments, just a big thank you to all of you. Thank you for having me. It was pleasant. It was very pleasant. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there, but in this way I could. So thank you very, very much.
We're so glad you could join us. And Shazan?
Yeah, I'll do maybe just short and sweet. No, great question about Canadian exceptionalism and this whole concept. And I think it's one of the prime debates in refugee resettlement policy is, this balance between humanitarianism and opportunism, right? So how do we balance these two things? Because ideally at its core, refugee policy is altruistic in nature, but ultimately, as Laura is going to point out and has done really eloquently in a lot of her work, is talking about how to become a refugee, it's a political process. You are defined as a refugee through a political process. And I think that's really critical because our responses are dictated by that. So by, governments around the world, certain groups are welcomed more quickly than others. We have to look no further than the difference between Afghanistan and Ukraine to see that. And so that's one of the biggest challenges. And I do really thank Dr. Madokoro for putting that forward in a lot of her literature because it's something that I really grappled with at first because one of her books presents this idea of not using the term refugee and using the term migrant instead, because to become a refugee, it is this political process, right? And so I struggled with it a lot, and I'll be honest, I've never admitted this to Laura, but because I was like, no, all these folks I'm interviewing are identifying themselves as refugees. Like, how can we shift this? But that's the reality. The reality is that there are certain folks that are identified as refugees, certain that are not. And so, we can look at other examples. If we look at the Rohingya and the response to that. So that's super long answer. The other one I do want to touch on is this concept of religiosity, incredible. And it was one of the things that came out in a lot of the interviews. So I focused on this idea of Canadian identity because all 49 people I interviewed used that word Canadian. I didn't prompt them to. It was, of their own choosing. So I wanted to dive into that. But all of them absolutely talked about how religious identity and foundation was so incremental for their settlement journey. People talk about how one of the first things they did when they arrived in Canada was try and find or reestablish whether it was Jama'khanas or accesses to churches or opportunities to practice their faith. And so I think one of the oldest examples I can think of is there's a family of 8 in the south of Sweden in Motala that continues to hold their own little mini ceremonies every single Friday in their own home. And they've been doing it for 50 years. And so I think that's something that certainly helps with integration and helps create that sense of home because no matter where you are, you always technically have your faith, which is incredible. And so I think that certainly helped folks. And I think the last one, introduce myself. Great point, Zane. I always say, yeah, child of Ugandan Asian refugee, because I mean, it's like my life's work, and I wrote a book about it, so I have to say it. But it is really close to me, and I think it's something that, you know, I hope we do continue to honor this legacy of this community, but also continue to challenge it, like as this second generation, as we reach these 50 years, ask those really tough questions about things like, you know, was this, you know, where do we do that reconciliation? How do we get ourselves back involved in Uganda? How do we nuance all the levels of the things that happened, and also, you know, interrogate that colonial sandwich, the race class hierarchy, and what that means, and how we benefited from the colonial structure and all that. So I'll just end with like a quote from one of the people I interviewed, because they do a really good job of explaining this, to say that, you know, when I came to Canada and I first started working at a factory, he had worked a shift that was 12 hours long, and he's like, and I got paid for 6 hours of work. And he's like, it wasn't until that happened to me that I understood the exploitation that we were reinforcing when we were in Uganda at the time, that I understood what it was like. And he says, and I'm going to quote him directly, because he says, and now everyone's denying it. And so I think that really speaks volumes to the realities of, you know, 50 years on, we can start to pick apart these pieces. So keep doing it, everyone here. Keep asking those great questions. It's awesome.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much to our panelists, to the audience members. We could have an entire conference, I think, on the question of identity and legacy alone. So thank you all. Thank you for accommodating the schedule changes. Please run for your coffee. The online panel will start shortly, and so please enjoy. Thank you.